Welcome to the Vinyl Files, ladies and gentlemen. If you don't know me, my name is James Lundquist, and I am a big fan of music history. And when I was about 11 years old, a friend of mine just slapped me across the face with a copy of The Fall of Ideals by All That Remains, and my mind was blown. You know, the jumping between the low and the high screams, and the clean vocals from Philip Labonte, and like the robotically precise drumming from Jason Costa, and Ollie Herbert's like savant alien note choices, it just got to me. And it opened my eyes to like a whole world of heavy music outside of the gates of true metal. And as I went beyond those gates, I found so much great music. And to me, I was a teenager at the perfect time when this scene blew up. Bands like Attack Attack, For Today, The Devil Wears Prada, August Burns Red were releasing some of their absolute best albums. We're gonna get into the history in just a moment, but for the uninitiated, if you don't know, metalcore is the fusion of punk and metal, creating one genre: hardcore, metalcore. And I'm a big fan of both of those genres. And I also happen to be a big fan of digging into the history of types of music, bands, the artists themselves, and the albums. So one day I was wondering to myself, how did we get here? How did we get from punk and metal to this bridge in between? How did we get metalcore here? And as I understand, back in the day, these two scenes didn't really mix. They weren't really fans of each other, but we got here somehow. So in part one of this series, because this is a series, we're going to be taking a look at the precursors, the architects, if you will, of metalcore itself. We're also going to be sticking around the 1980s for the most part today. There might be a little bit of like leakage into the 90s, but we're going to be sticking around in the 80s with the forefathers of metalcore. And before we get started, be sure to leave this video a like, I'd sure appreciate it, and go ahead and subscribe, join the vinyl cult, so you don't miss when the next episode gets uploaded. So, let's get into it. As far as this first episode goes, we're going to be sticking more towards the punk side of things. While both sides are equally important and heavy metal obviously plays a huge role in this music, the punks are the ones who really adopted the elements of metal and brought it over and kind of bridged that gap. Now, as much as punk rock was a reaction to the defanging of the rebellious spirit of rock and roll, hardcore was a reaction to the OG capital P 1977 punk rock. Bands like the Sex Pistols, The Clash, the Ramones, X-Ray Spex. Kids that went to these shows started to notice the toll that the punk rock lifestyle was taking on their musical idols. Between overdoses, murder, poverty, and abandonment of the music altogether, people started to see the cracks in the facade. And just as the plane crash that killed Buddy Holly was seen to be the death of rock and roll, the death of Sid Vicious, formerly of the Sex Pistols, seemed to be the final death knell of the first wave of punk rock. However, the kids and young adults that were going to those shows were starting and joining bands just as fast as they could restring their guitars. Owed heavily to the Ramones, who are known as the Johnny Appleseeds of punk. Popping up on the West Coast with bands like the Dead Kennedys and Black Flag, and on the East Coast with bands like Bad Brains and Minor Threat. And these bands were different than the original punks. Their sound was much more focused on speed and aggression rather than melody. And these two scenes merged speed and aggression perfectly when a Washington, D.C. native and SOA frontman Henry Garfield was recruited as the new lead singer for the band Black Flag. After joining the band, a name change to the last name Rollins, and the influence of his bandmates' taste in music, their sound started to change. Through listening to many interviews and podcasts and whatnot with Henry Rollins, I get the sense that if you were a punk fan at the time, Black Sabbath LPs just weren't cool anymore. But Greg Ginn and Chuck Dukowski assigned young Henry homework. Truly, to understand Black Flag, you have to understand Black Sabbath, and especially the rhythm section. And I believe it was Chuck Dukowski who said if you don't have a solid rhythm section, you don't have a band. Which is true. And while Damaged by Black Flag is just as much of a staple to hardcore as Rocket to Russia is to punk rock, it wasn't until the album My War came out in 1984 that the aggression of punk was mixed with the heaviness of Black Sabbath by way of their first album. Particularly side 2 of this album was a departure of hardcore stereotypes and from Black Flag's sound specifically. Slow tempos, palm-muted guitars, distinguishable guitar riffs replaced the loud, fast rules that were held so sacred by punk and hardcore. And oh boy was this polarizing. People accused them of selling out and asking if they were a heavy metal band now. Partially due to the sound of the music, but also in the change of the band's appearances. Henry went from bald, skinny, crazy guy to long-haired, buff, stoic guy. Retrospectively, however, this is regarded as one of Black Flag's finest works, as well as a major influence on math rock, grunge, sludge metal, and of course metalcore. Meanwhile, over on the East Coast, the originators of horror punk had just released their last album of the 1980s. I'm talking, of course, about the Misfits and the album Earth AD. This record is crucial to the conception of metalcore for many reasons, the biggest of which being the breakneck speed at which this album was played. It goes without questioning that this album was influenced by metal, and with the addition of Black Flag's previous drummer Robo, you can see the speed of Black Flag's earlier recordings seeping into the Misfits as well as his bandmates' tasted music. This album, and in general the Misfits, were a particular favorite of a band that would one day become one of the biggest metal bands in history, Metallica. One of the faster songs on the record was re-recorded in 1987 for Metallica's 598 EP, Green Hell. And Metallica certainly drew influence from punk. By the mid-1980s, the mostly separated punk and metal scenes finally started to merge. Fans from both scenes started to cross-pollinate and start bands, resulting in crossover. Bands like Suicidal Tendencies, DRI were among these. Crossover literally meaning the mix of hardcore punk and metal. And along with the term crossover, the first use of the word metalcore was used around this time to describe these bands. And around this time, you start seeing the hardcore breakdown popping up from certain bands around the scene. Now, a breakdown in broad musical terms is a part of the song where instruments have solo parts. However, in metal and hardcore, it has a slightly different definition. In early hardcore songs, it had more of a quick rhythm on the drums to bring up the energy. A prime example of this could be found in Bad Brains' reggae-style breakdowns in Banned in DC. And for the metal side of it, the perfect example could be found in Slayer's 1986 classic, Raining Blood. Around this time, we also saw the formation of one of the most important bands as far as pushing the genre forward, the Cro-Mags. Their influence can still be felt to this day, especially when it comes to the tough guy image of modern hardcore. And in speaking of tough guy music, we wouldn't have modern metalcore without beatdown hardcore. Now, I'll be honest, this subgenre is new to me, but only by name. I think when a lot of people think of hardcore, they're thinking about beatdown hardcore, at least to the uninitiated. Now, beatdown is a subgenre of hardcore punk with a heavy focus in heavy metal. And while that sounds very similar to crossover and metalcore from this time, it's a little bit different because they have a much bigger focus on the metal side of things. Aggressive screamed vocals, down-tuned guitars, heavy breakdowns. Like it's all there. That metal side of it is really coloring the punk side of it in such a deliciously brutal way. And while some people might disagree with me, I do think that beatdown takes a lot of influence from hip-hop as well. The feel of beatdown is heavily focused on the rhythm. And while that's not a one-to-one comparison, considering the birthplace of both of these types of music, you could see how beatdown would draw influence from hip-hop, because they were both born in New York City. And this is where we start to pick out bits and pieces that sound familiar today, trends, approaches, and formulas that carry over to modern-day metalcore. And this seems like a good stopping point for this week. Though we're not quite to kill switch engage, the groundwork has indeed been laid. And you can really see how collaborative of an effort this was to get where we are. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Be sure to comment down below who got you into metalcore. Leave a like, don't forget to subscribe to the Vinyl Files, join the vinyl cult, and remember, until the table stops spinning, just keep grinning. I'll see you in part 2.